So kia ora koutou katoa, ko Mark Fitzpatrick toko ingoa, ko taku mahi ki Aotearoa Circle, ko te Director Partnerships. Hello everyone, a very warm welcome. My name is Mark Fitzpatrick and I am the Partnerships Director here at the Aotearoa Circle. Welcome to our webinar on our Seafood Sector Adaptation workstream, where we will discuss the incredible work the sector has been undertaking behind the scenes for some 5 years now, and the learnings for businesses across all sectors from the way in which this work has been delivered. Very pleased to be facilitating this webinar today with a spotlight on seafood, aquaculture and wild catch. I'd like to thank you and our guest speakers for giving up your valuable time. I'd also like to recognise the truly valued support and contributions of our partners. Without your incredible support and your work, our work to restore our biggest asset, nature, for shared resilience and prosperity would not be possible. And the support of our guardians, who bring their extensive leadership experience to the table to collectively guide the circle. Thank you for your support. For those of you not familiar with our kaupapa, the circle exists to enable the restoration of our natural capital, the fuel for our economy, with a vision of enduring prosperity for Aotearoa New Zealand. We're working with urgency to address the tipping point nature is facing and are delivering impactful work through our public-private partnership. So today marks an important milestone, not just for the Aotearoa Circle, but for New Zealand's entire seafood sector. From the beginning, we recognised a stark truth. Climate change poses an existential threat to our seafood sector because of its impacts on nature. Shifts in our natural realms, such as rising ocean temperatures, acidification, species migration, along with changing consumer demands, regulatory shifts, and escalating fuel costs are no longer distant forecasts. They're already reshaping how, where, and what we fish and farm. This is not just about the viability of individual businesses. It's about the cultural, ecological, and economic fabric of Aotearoa, a fabric deeply woven with our strong relationship to the sea, given 65% of New Zealanders live within 5 kilometres of the ocean. So, understanding the challenge, we need to consider potential responses. 5 years ago, we started supporting the sector and commencing a significant journey, a journey to understand, support, and ultimately strengthen the resilience of one of our most important natural capital assets, our moana and those that depend on it. In 2020, we produced the country's first ever sector climate scenarios before standards called for them across the board. This led to the development of a seafood adaptation strategy under the leadership of key sector leaders. From there, we entered implementation, kicking off a near 3-year project co-funded by SFFF, determining, testing, and finalising the adaptation actions the sector could undertake to adapt. This process was comprehensive, with multiple phases developing a suite of deliverables. All this work culminated in the development of seafood sector adaptation toolkits, providing many projects and associated actions the sector could undertake to adapt across deep water, inshore, and aquaculture ventures. Importantly, alongside of the what needed to be undertaken to adapt, was also the how this should be done. Of utmost importance was giving effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi in this endeavour. But how? To shape this up, the team at KPMG completed a comprehensive study culminating in 3 key deliverables, being the whakapapa of the seafood sector to Māori, Te Tiriti o Waitangi guidance, and examples of how the toolkits could be implemented in a way that gave effect to the treaty. Today we'll be talking through the whole journey, and you'll hear from some of those who have been instrumental in the development and completion of the work. So why is this webinar titled Collaboration in Action? Well, simply put, it could not have happened without the convening power of the Circle, bringing together the key players in the sector. To undertake all this work, we convened a diverse and unprecedented coalition. These were leaders and experts from government, Māori, industry, banking, research and environmental NGOs who came together not to work in parallel, but to work as one. So today, our first speaker needs a little introduction, Alec Tang, partner at KPMG. Alec will talk to the start of our journey in 2020 and KPMG's important role in helping chart the course over the following 5 years. Next, we'll hear from James Butler, Transdisciplinary Science Group Manager at Cawthron, on the extensive process undertaken to determine the strategies which underpinned the adaptation toolkits. Then we have James Simon, Senior Aquaculture Scientist at Cawthron, and Dave Taylor, Technical Director at Aquaculture New Zealand, sharing the stage. And Jane and Dave will discuss the Aquaculture Toolkit. We'll close with a panel conversation about how cross-sector collaboration is required to address the challenges we face, ranging from the decarbonisation of fuel to the impact of degraded nature from climate change and other factors. We have a fantastic panel lineup to extend beyond just the seafood sector to discuss the importance of collaboration, including Stu Yorston from Sealord, Kapua Smith from KPMG, Kim Kelleher from Contact Energy, and James Butler from Cawthron. Throughout the panel discussion, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function, and time dependent, we'll direct as many as we can to the panelists. So that's enough from me. Let's get underway. Alec, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today. I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora, Mark. Kia ora koutou, tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa, ko Alec Tang toka ingoa. Lovely to be here. Awesome to be able to share some of this journey with you. Those of you probably like me can't remember what happened last week. So my job is to just give a bit of a snapshot of all this great work that's happened over the past 5 years. And we'll start with the scenarios. As Mark highlighted, back in 2020, the Circle with KPMG as a secretariat had this first attempt at sector-based climate scenarios prior to the XRB's guidance, prior to those mandatory disclosure standards being set. And the work, as you can imagine, or those of you who were there, many of you were, brought together government, iwi, industry, research and community to explore the future risks and opportunities that the sector could face. And Two scenarios were created. Mako, a 2050 world where global emissions haven't been curbed, the marine environment is changing rapidly, warming is on track to exceed 4 degrees by 2100 with a major physical and socioeconomic consequences for the seafood sector. Ka Hawaii, a more positive 2050 outcome where global action has limited warming to below 2 degrees, but rapid decarbonisation brings significant disruption and adjustment changes. And through these scenarios, the sector explored the complexity and interconnectivity of climate-related risks, and that they were, in many cases, already unfolding. The scenarios also highlighted that risks and opportunities can't be tackled in isolation, and this has been the starting point for a lot of this work, that collaboration is essential to address those risks and opportunities. The positive from the work was that the seafood sector was well placed in Aotearoa thanks to strong governance under Te Tiriti, the Fisheries Act, and our geographic advantage. So it was both a challenging set of scenarios, but also heartening, and set the context with the conclusion that only with collaborative sector-wide work, a collective adaptation strategy, could we really address those impacts of climate-related risks in the seafood sector. And so following on from that work, the scenarios made it really clear that the question is no longer should we respond to climate change, but how do we respond? So building on these scenarios, the Circle with KPMG still as secretariat convened leaders and experts from across government, industry, banking, research and environmental groups to develop what is the first and perhaps the only sector-wide coordinated response to this challenge, the Seafood Sector Climate Adaptation Strategy. And you see here the current and past members of that leadership group that was brought together to help create this adaptation strategy. And so the strategy recognized that these climate risks, as I said, were unfolding now, that they're not limited to one area, that economic, environmental and social disruption will affect the entire sector. And again, that no single organization, whether commercial, iwi, government, science, could adapt effectively on their own. And so the strategy, as it was released back in 2021, emphasized the need for that sector-wide collaboration, the need for iwi industry regulators and others to build resilience. That bold leadership is required, and you'll hear from some of these leaders later on in the webinar, but also that evidence and practical knowledge is critical to guide our actions, that adaptation planning must be grounded in the best available of science and should recognize that we need to evolve as our knowledge grows. And finally, that this context which sits at the heart of the Aotearoa Circle kaupapa around public-private partnership being critical. So the strategy, those of you who haven't seen it, focuses on the commercial seafood sector. It includes diverse businesses, iwi Māori-owned organisations, again, those regulators, researchers and NGOs. It acknowledges that customary and recreational fishers, as well as our supply chain partners, have vital roles to play, and that building collaborative relationships will be essential to reinforcing climate resilience across the whole system. So in short, and a whistle stop apologies to the strategy and the work that you'll hear about is all about enabling proactive, coordinated action across the sector so that fundamentally that future generations can enjoy a thriving marine environment, seafood communities and a resilient blue economy. So I'll leave it there and pass on back to you, Mark.
Yeah, look, thank you, Alec. And unfortunately, today we have an hour for a webinar, so we've only got enough time for a bit of a whistle stop tour. Each of those reports on their own could warrant a webinar, but we haven't got time today. So we're taking you through them, and later on we'll provide you with a link to be able to access all the materials. So, look, thank you, Alec. That work was incredible. It was set a very strong foundation. And once this foundational work was complete, we recognised the need to form a group of experts who knew the detail that would be required to effectively implement the work. Leadership is important, but we needed to shift into the world of action. And to deliver on this, we established an implementation group made up by a number of industry experts, some of which we're hearing from today. Together, it was this group that produced what you'll hear about. And James, you're certainly first on the list to talk about the work that was undertaken. So we'll now hand over to you to take us through the first steps of that implementation work.
Kia ora koutou. I hope you can hear me and you can see that full screen slide. Can you confirm, yes. Mark? Yes. Okay, thank you. So yes, to carry on the story, the Aotearoa Circle and the implementation group for the seafood aquaculture strategy contacted the Cawthorne Institute to try and execute some work around developing what we call adaptation pathways for the seafood sector. And myself and a colleague, Nick Craddock-Henry, who should be online, I think, spearheaded this work, and with many colleagues and collaborators who I'll come to later. So I'm just going to quickly describe what we did and some of the results and possibly some of the takeaway lessons as well that we can discuss a bit later in this webinar. So the big issues you're probably well aware in terms of climate change is that yes, the globe is warming, but what that means in terms of future temperatures is still very uncertain, and a lot of that is due to the very variable responses that society as a whole can take to limit greenhouse gas emissions, but also there's a lot of variability in the models that we use. So the future uncertainty around projecting what might happen is very broad. And while most of us think hard, I think about the impact of increasing temperatures on particular species that we're interested in, for example, green shell mussels, there's actually a lot more uncertainty than just that in terms of impact. There's also thinking about the broader economic and policy environment which enterprises will be working within. Consumer preferences are changing. The whole issue of taxes on carbon and freight and so on are looming. And then, of course, we've got shocks to the global system as well. We now live in a globalized society. As was shown by COVID, things happen in one part of the globe that can affect the rest of us very quickly. And of course, now we have shocks in terms of wars as well, which are affecting food prices and so on. So all of these combine to make the future for enterprises of any description, but seafood especially, extremely uncertain, and probably more uncertain in many ways than before. And so we've been working as researchers for over a decade now on an approach to try and help people at various scales and levels deal with this uncertainty and how to plan for all of this. And the method we've been developing is around adaptation pathways. And just a quick definition here, it's a proactive formulation of a series of decision points to implement a suite of strategies designed to address emerging climate risks and opportunities while maintaining flexibility to respond to unexpected future change. So the analogy is that we're on a very narrow mountain road in a four-wheel drive heading into the mist with some extreme risks on either side of the road, a vertical precipice on one side and a rock wall on the other. So how do we navigate that and make our way through the mist in order to get to where we want to get to? So in sort of an abstract sense, this is a diagram just to quickly show how we do this. So the road is effectively that pale strip through the middle of this diagram and what we call the adaptive space. That's where we want to be. That's where we're flexible and we can turn slightly to the left or to the right and adjust what we're doing and get to our vision, which is somewhere in beyond the mist. But where we don't want to be is in this maladaptive space, which is either off in the precipice or up against the rock wall where we're stuck. And we have really very few options to get back to where we want to be. But that space is changing all the time by the climate change that's happening, but also other system drivers like the shocks that I mentioned. And also as we implement our adaptation pathways, the system will change as well. So it's never fixed. And that mist is constantly shifting and changing, as is the road that we're on. And so what we do through adaptation pathways planning is we scan forwards as to what might happen, both in terms of what that road might look like and where we want to be and the vision that we want to get to, but also what the precipice might look like as it changes in the fog. And then we design adaptation pathways, which are a series of actions and decision points. That we have some that we call no regret strategies, which whatever happens in the future, they're sensible things that will keep us on the road heading towards where we want to get to. But there may also be some more transformational ones, which we will need to implement if and when we need to shift suddenly. Let's say the right front wheel has just begun to get to the edge of the road, or the front left one is about to hit the precipice. How do we quickly shift and drastically shift to stay on the road that we want as the fog shows us the new future that we're facing? And so we were asked by the Aotearoa Circle and the implementation group to look at 4 case studies how we in order to apply this approach. And this was in 2023. We did 2 fisheries. We did the deep water hoki fishery and the inshore snapper fishery. And for aquaculture, we did salmon and green shell mussels. And the first step in this was to gather together the current state of knowledge about climate impacts, not just now, but also projected for the future for each of those industry case studies. And we produced these infographics which summarized everything that we knew currently about these potential impacts. And then we held some workshops, and these workshops were designed specifically to generate social learning between all the decision makers in each of those industries. So we pulled together members of the various companies involved, the regulators, NGOs, iwi representatives where possible, and so on. So to try and generate sharing of knowledge between all the different stakeholders that are involved in each industry. And I'm just going to run you through some photos here of what we did for the salmon workshop, and there's some familiar faces, I'm sure, to many of you in that group there. So the first session, we really thought about the current system and the drivers of change, and we heard from the industry and others about what the issues are around the industry, how it operates, what the future looks like from their perspective. We then presented the current knowledge on climate change and impacts potentially. We then moved into thinking about what are the drivers of change, and in the case of salmon here, you can see on the left-hand side, there's a lot of these blue stickers or votes around planning, policy and regulation. That was considered to be the biggest driver of change for the industry, and climate change was second to that. And then we started thinking about a vision. What does the industry want to get to? What does it want to look like in, let's say, 20, 30 years' time? And then we started thinking about the adaptive and maladaptive futures that might happen depending on how the drivers of change shift. And then we started looking at adaptation strategy options that would be both no regrets, but possibly also transformational as well. And then we started placing those into pathways of actions and decisions. And so what came out of these workshops was some fairly detailed tables of actions and who particularly should be involved in making those actions happen. These are just, again, for the salmon aquaculture industry, and these are green ones, which are basically no regrets, incremental strategies that they should implement regardless, because they'll get us towards where we want to be. And then what we did is we synthesized these up into sort of a broader roadmap of strategies and pathways, and in particular focusing in on some of these key decision points and how they might affect the future of the industry. And here for salmon, you can see that the two big issues where the industry may go towards its vision or not really rest upon agile legislation being enacted or not, and more open ocean aquaculture being approved or not. And those two key decision points really determine whether the industry grows sustainably within Aotearoa New Zealand, or perhaps potentially ends up being much smaller and on land, or perhaps even farming overseas. For the fisheries, here's just an example for the hoki fishery. Interestingly, a sort of a much smaller set of adaptation strategies and pathways there, but some key, again, transformational issues and decision points around fuel, and also potentially just the economics of hoki fishing in the future as well, when potentially the industry may just not be viable anymore at all, and then has to think about seriously shifting to alternative species for fishing, but also perhaps also supporting offshore aquaculture or even seaweed transportation. So a very, very different story for hoki versus salmon aquaculture. What came out of the workshops as well was that there were clearly some cross-cutting issues that affected all four industries, and these really were the systemic barriers to adaptation. And if we don't deal with these, then it's very difficult for those four industries to adapt, and by extension, the rest of the seafood sector as well. And the four issues, which I think we'll come back to in a moment, are agile regulatory frameworks, climate change and vulnerability forecasting, oceans as a national research priority, largely because there are huge knowledge gaps in terms of what climate change actually means for these industries, and also fleet decarbonisation. So we also did some evaluations of the workshops, and in 2024, about 4 or 5 months after we held them, and it was interesting that some of the key outcomes that emerged were increasing trust between all of those participants, bearing in mind that there's a very broad spectrum of people involved, and also strengthened collaborations as a result of these workshops. Not so much in terms of actual action, because it was very, very soon after the workshops had actually been carried out, so that was perhaps not surprising. So lessons learned. We looked across all of the actions in all of the pathways that were developed across those 4 case studies, and we figured out that 61% of the sort of incremental, no regrets actions could be implemented by the private sector alone, which is good news. So they can get on with an awful lot of stuff on their own. However, 50% of the more transformational actions needed public-private sector collaboration. So of all of those big issues, those blue arrows, to implement them, about 50% of actions required further collaboration over the long term. So this raised some interesting questions about how then do we maintain the circle's momentum across particularly political and economic cycles to tackle those cross-cutting issues and those transformational actions. And a big question is who actually owns the pathways process, because bear in mind, this is not just a one-off. This should be done incrementally over 3-4 year cycles as the future unfolds and everything changes faster and faster. So that raises an interesting question. The other thing that became clear was that these are very high-level pathways for the whole of industry, but I think that there clearly needs to be more detailed level pathways developed for enterprises individually. And to that end, we're very fortunate to have secured an MB program called Climate Adapted Finfish, being run by Jane Simons from Cawthron, where we are developing some of those more enterprise level, more detailed pathways approaches for aquaculture particularly. So that's a big thank you from me to everyone who took part, but especially to the team involved at the Cawthron Institute, but also our friends at NIWA, and within the implementation group as well, and Fisheries New Zealand, who in particular, who supported the mussel workshop. So kia ora everyone, and thanks for that.
In each of those 4 areas that were explored through the processes that James's team led, have an associated report. which are available on our website and the knowledge sharing platform. So if we go back in time to the end of that, so once that work was completed, the strategies were determined, we then needed to convert them into actions. So we needed to determine what was required to deliver on those strategies. And the first step was to take what had been identified through the process that was just outlined and test it for suitability. We did that through a series of pilot programs with the seafood sector at organisation, species and strategic levels. And once they were tested, the implementation group were able to develop the toolkits. And so now we're handing over to Jane and Dave. Thank you both for joining us today. And Jane and Dave are going to take you through the journey of developing the aquaculture toolkit. Thanks, Jane and Dave.
Kia ora koutou, ko Jane Simons aho. I'm a scientist at the Cawthorne Institute working on aquaculture, and I joined the implementation group in 2022. And that really gave me a great opportunity as a scientist to meet industry and stakeholders across the sector and people from government as well, and really broadened my sort of understanding of the importance of climate change adaptation. I had seen what effect that climate change was having on the seafood sector, and it was really causing some great challenges. So it was great to be able to take my knowledge and work with people like James and social scientists to think it's not just about breeding and genetics, which is my area, but it's also using that knowledge within social adaptation planning processes that James mentioned. So we did develop an idea for the research program alongside working with the implementation group. And I think that really came home to me when we did the planning workshops, how important this process was. And also it was enlightening in that, in fact, there was quite a lot of things that we could actually do working with the industry. So we were very lucky, as James mentioned, to get the climate change adaptation program funded by MB for finfish, and that started in 2023. And that meant we could really expand on the research that we'd been discussing in the implementation group and actually put some of them into action. So we did develop, or are developing, enterprise-specific case studies, which allows us to work with individual companies and iwi to develop their own bespoke adaptation plans. So as James and Mark mentioned, we really wanted to develop something out of this that the industry could use. So the toolkits were born out of this. So they provide some practical guidelines for how the industry can use the information that we've developed. And that combined the learnings from the implementation group with the climate adapted finfish program. And again, it was important to be collaborative in this process. So I worked closely with Dave Taylor from Aquaculture New Zealand, Catherine Moysen for MPI, and also Peter Longdon from Sanford. And we were able to take the pathways that we developed, that James mentioned we developed from the workshops, and use them to build the framework. Not just the salmon worm, we also had one of these adaptation pathways from the mussel workshop, which then became the aquaculture toolkit. So the first level of the toolkit is identifying the main strategies. So within that, farmers can farm climate resilient stocks, and we look at, well, how might you go about creating climate resilient stocks? There's also different things that can be done on the farm through husbandry or feed or location. There's also diversification. That can be farming different species depending on the location. It can also be diversifying into different farming methods. For finfish, we really need feeds that are suitable for different conditions, including summer diets. We also need, with all of the global unrest and insecurity, feed supply, as most of it's imported. So we need to make sure that that's secure. As others have mentioned, underpinning adaptation with science and then being able to test that science in the real world is critical. So actually having test sites out on farms is really valuable for being able to test ideas. And again, this has to be underpinned by research so that science can help enable these adaptation. And again, as a cross-cutting initiative, we were also interested in what did decarbonising freight and packaging look like for aquaculture. So within the toolkit, which is online now, you can go in there and look at the different strategies. And then within that, there's different projects. So this is just an example. So for example, if we want to farm climate resilient stocks, how can we do that? Well, it's key to have really good adaptation plans and be backed by breeding for climate change resilience, for example, and also husbandry. It's also important to be looking at improved health management and have proper processes for that in place. And particularly for the shellfish industry who rely on wild-caught spat or hatchery-produced spat, it's really important that there is a reliable supply to keep the industry going. So those are some of the strategies and projects that we identified. And then within the toolkit, we then identify specific actions, such as developing an adaptation plan and identifying breeding objectives, but not just for now, but also in the future. In order to look into that future and what we do need good climate forecasting models to be able to inform where we're going, and then also look at the cost-benefit analysis. So there are so many actions we could take. What are the priorities and what are the costs, benefits? And again, developing decision support tools to help industry target where they want to go and how they can do it. But again, framing that within the sort of national development plans, such as the New Zealand Aquaculture Plan, is really important as well. We don't do this in isolation. So that first one, which is about adaptation and breeding, was really the focus of the Climate Adapted Finfish MB Endeavour that we got funded. So that was combining adaptation plan with future adaptive breeding strategies. So breeding is fine, but it really does need to be embedded within a general strategy for a company or the industry. And we're going to also looking at how we incorporate Mataranga Maori into that, working with iwi. So we've been looking at salmon and also tonga species such as snapper tamure. And the learnings, we're almost 2 years into this program. So the learnings that we developed from this were also combined into developing the toolkit. And the theme for today is about partnerships and collaborators. So again, the MB Endeavour is all about working together to have the best outcomes. We're all reliant on the sea and the aquatic environment. So we work together with CRIs, with universities, with iwi, with breeding companies, with industry companies, and also we're very grateful for the support that we get from MPI and MBIE, and also for Aotearoa Circle for being key stakeholders to enable this. So now I'm going to pass over to Dave Taylor, who's going to talk about how the industry can use the toolkit. Thank you, Dave. Kia ora,
Jane. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Dave Taylor toko ingoa, ko te kaiwhakahaere hangaru e te ahumoana o Aotearoa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Taylor, the Technical Director at Aquaculture New Zealand, which is the industry body for aquaculture here in Aotearoa. Along with Jane, I've had the pleasure of being involved in the Seafood Adaptation Strategy Implementation Group since 2022. And as you've seen, the process brought together industry, scientists, and most importantly, the data and environmental information that we needed alongside government in a collaborative journey to understand how climate has changed already and what we've done along the way and how it's likely to change further into the future. And then building a map forward, as you've seen, of how the seafood sector might adapt to the challenges that come along the way, be prepared, proactively prepared for those challenges, so that we stay in that adaptive space that James talked about, where we've got the opportunity to move and aren't coming up against brick walls. And, you know, by being proactive, then we're poised and ready to realise potential opportunities that come up as well, because it's not only about constantly coming up against challenges. Along the way, we identified things that could really provide opportunities for industry. So if you're proactive and ready to go, then you can realise those opportunities better. Aquaculture obviously has the benefit of having several levers it can pull to adapt. we've got the fish or shellfish in an area that we know where they are, don't have to go hunting for them, they're on our farms, and through the process of the climate adaptation workshops with the Aotearoa Circle, with the salmon and mussel farming industries, it became clear that in many ways those industries have already been adapting for the last 10, 15 years. They've been really working hard to adapt to the climate challenges. So in developing the toolkits, we had quite a good starting point, and a lot of the things that we thought that would be, had to be addressed were already in the process of being addressed. There were some things, obviously, some ongoing challenges that James talked about around policy settings that are still, potential barriers along the way. But we already have a good understanding of some of the levers that can be pulled, and we could then use those to build these toolkits that James talked about. So which ones have already been pulled, which could be pulled now, and which you'd probably want to look at pulling a little bit further on the horizon. Through the adaptation toolkits, we showed that we can, adapt further. And one of the things we can do, as James talked about, is what we farm, and that's by investing in things like breeding technologies, things that help build resilient stocks, breeding infrastructure, things like hatcheries, nurseries, and breeding programs that can set us on a pathway of resilience and adaptation. We can also control in aquaculture. We have the ability to control where we farm, and we can do that, for example, by, as long as we have a really good understanding of the environment we're farming in, we might be able to move stocks from only farm some farms at some times of year. We might be able to only farm certain life stages on certain farms, and those those adaptations can enable us to use farming areas for longer at different times of year and maintain productivity. We also have the option to adapt how we farm, and that comes through investing in on-farm technologies, things like new nets, structures, ways that increase water flow or oxygenation in our systems, farm alignment so that we can deal with more challenging climate conditions, and having things like climate resilient feeds, for example, all of which benefit from that underpinning research that Jane talked about that enables farmers to make informed decisions about where they invest to adapt. And finally, we know we can work together and collaborate and grow market access and leverage our fantastic environmental credentials that we already have by working together and maintaining these fantastic environmental credentials, things like decarbonising freight, decarbonising packaging, those sort of areas we can work on in that sort of non-competitive space. Next slide, please, Jane. So when we look at those future opportunities, really it is those no regrets space, and the toolkits highlight where we can collaborate in that non-competitive space in areas like biosecurity, fish health research, resilience tools, low carbon packaging, decarbonising freight. They're all areas that we can work together and be prepared and proactively address things, and like I said before, realise opportunities that come up along the way to really showcase ourselves in the global market. And by being proactive and showing and being a proactive industry in this space, and leading, then it gives government and it also gives investors confidence that we're well prepared, we're proactively addressing things, and we're ready, and that gives investors confidence in supporting our aspirations for growth as an industry. So that's why we go down this pathway. So I was asked, what's the advice for other sectors? Well, really, it's to get started now. Our industry had been doing lots of adaptation, but it gave us a clear direction as a sector of what had been done and where we could go, and really where we have to put our efforts to maintain that, that adaptive space. Then, as Jane said, it gives you the opportunity to drill down for individual companies, and it gives individual companies the ability to have a look at a sector plan and see how they fit, where they're going, where they are on their own individual journeys, and help them develop their own adaptation plans, really working together on these shared challenges, coming up with ways to innovate together, because we're a relatively small country, small industry. If we can share those innovations and maintain our amazing environmental credentials, it has fantastic benefits, for the industry as a whole, and really lifts everyone along the way. Ngā mihi. Cheers. Thank you.
Teams dropped off. So look, thank you very much. We just wanted to put the slide up again as a way of highlighting the implementation group and the hard work that they have completed. It was an incredibly long journey that they undertook, and it would not have been possible, the work that was completed, without the collaborative effort that everyone undertook. So as part of the process that has been outlined, a series of cross-cutting initiatives were also identified. These were adaptation challenges, as shown on screen. We'll just move one more slide, thanks, Han, that applied to all parts of the seafood sector, and in many cases beyond the seafood sector. They were each defined with a problem definition and a why behind the need to address them. Then a series of actions were developed along with the scope of deliverables and the accountable entity, project teams, indicative resources, associated timelines for delivery. And essentially these cross-cutting initiatives, if we move forward one more slide, have become business cases that can be picked up and run with. Notably, the Circle have commenced one of them, fleet decarbonisation, through our Future Fit Shipping workstream, which is we've actually got a webinar coming up on that in the next week. So, without further ado, let's move into our panel discussion, where we can dive into the collaboration aspect of this workstream and talk about nature climate collaboration more generally. So, a very warm welcome to Stu Yorston, General Manager of Business Development and Sustainability at Sealord, Kapua Smith, Partner from KPMG, Kim Kelleher, Sustainability and Community Manager from Contact Energy, and welcome back to James Butler from Cawthron. Look, this work stream demonstrates the power of a collective commitment to addressing the challenges the seafood sector is facing. How could this approach be used by others in other sectors, and also facing climate change related impacts on nature and resources? So, Stu, to kick this off, can we start with you? Improving the fuel efficiency of the fishing fleet has been identified as a priority action across the seafood sector, with a strong focus on reducing emissions from fuel consumption. But we know achieving this is going to require collaboration beyond the seafood sector itself. From your perspective, where are the most critical interdependencies with other industries, and how can the cross-sector collaboration help unlock that progress? Just, you have to come off mute.
Thanks, Mark. There's several parts to this, and I guess we're a hard to abate, capital intensive industry, particularly when you look at a deep sea vessel can cost anywhere between $20 and $100 million, and we can operate them for 30 years. So in the short term, we need to work across the industry and share as many fuel optimization opportunities as possible with each other. So for example, we know that doing a regular thorough clean of our boilers on a vessel can improve its fuel consumption by about 10%. So automatically that has quite a big impact on our fuel that we burn at sea. In the long term, though, when it comes to significant reduction of the maritime emissions, due to the capital required, as I mentioned, the New Zealand fishing industry are going to be followers and not leaders in this space. The shipping industry actually are probably the leaders in adapting to new fuel alternatives. And so we need to work with government, with freight businesses, with fuel companies, with cruise line operators to ensure that our point of view and requirements are considered when they are working through developing supply chains for low carbon fuel options. And this includes understanding the local biofuel supply, where is it coming from, through to developing potentially infrastructure for methanol or hydrogen. Now, those may or may not be relevant to the deep sea vessels, but it's important that it's considered in terms of a full end-to-end for non-fossil fuels. Where we want to be involved in the conversation, and planning will be critical around that. And as you said, this work has already commenced with the recent Aotearoa Circle Future Fit Shipping report. I think the more that all the maritime industries can work together around the fuel supply, the better.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. Certainly what we found with our work is that increasingly the findings that come from our projects apply to more than one sector, and this is absolutely one of those, no doubt about it. Similarly, Kapua, coming to you, your team's work within the work stream highlights both the significant presence and the influence of Māori within the seafood sector, as well as the importance of integrating Mātauranga Māori to support industry resilience. So from your perspective, what opportunities exist for the seafood sector through deeper collaboration with Māori, and how can this strengthen both risk management and long-term resilience?
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, ko Kapua Smith tēnei, huri no Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Awa me Ngāti Apa, e mihi ana. Thank you for the question, Mark. I think the first thing I want to say is Māori participate in the seafood sector in a whole lot of different and diverse ways. So the mahi that KPMG did was to pull out and highlight the connection, the relationship, the whakapapa that Māori have to the seafood industry, and to identify ways that we can bring that voice, that diverse voice, into the work that we're doing in the adaptation space. So in terms of how those partnerships can work, Māori are commercial participants. In fact, Māori own a third of the fishing assets that are currently in play. We have a science-based or mātauranga body that we can bring to solving the complex challenges that we're seeing, particularly in the adaptation space. And maybe at this point, I'll just say climate change, as we know, is a dynamic systems-based challenge. We need dynamic and innovative solutions to come to this problem, which is why the collaboration is really important, and also how it contributes to managing risk into the future and to unlocking potential. The other bit I want to add in terms of how you engage with Māori is as kaitiaki, not just of an environmental resource, but of a knowledge base as well. And I think if we go back to first principles, when it comes to working together to solve challenges, the base of any positive relationship starts with values alignment as well. And I think that's something that we've uncovered in the work we did, bringing Te Ao Māori perspectives into the scenarios work that we have done. Those values actually result in more environmentally sustainable and socially resilient solutions in the future. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kapua. Well said. And Kim, I think building on that and shifting to a more general perspective on collaboration, Contact Energy has been active in the sustainability space for many years, has a proven track record of building successful collaborations, and you know, throughout your career you've had a similar experience. So in your experience, what are the most critical ingredients for making collaboration both effective and enduring?
Yeah, kia ora, Mark, and kia ora koutou. There's definitely, if I think about collaborations on different scales, you know, locally right through to industry and then cross-industry or cross-sector, I think that there are definitely some generic things that kind of show up all the time. And some of the ones that come to mind for me are really around that shared purpose. And I think you could also add that shared value alignment that Kapua just mentioned. Some sort of structured process and architecture that supports the collaboration really effectively. And we already heard from a number of the speakers just around how they leaned into, you know, really good process and structured design. And then finally, the building that relational trust. So I think, you know, firstly, collaboration really needs to be anchored in that really clearly defined challenge that all the parties recognise is worth solving together. It's the piece that we kind of rally around. It's got to be framed in a way that resonates with the participants and you know, take the time to fully explore that right at the outset. I think you can often, or we can, have this tendency to try and sort of rush through that formative stage. And I think that early stage, the foundational piece, is where you really get into that values alignment piece, where you really get in around that shared kaupapa. So that's really important. Then secondly, I'd say that structure and process matters for success. So effective collaboration just doesn't happen by accident. It really needs good governance and leadership and tools that support the decision making and potentially, you know, things like shared data sources. So that's more around the sort of architecture that's set up, or the envelope that sets it up for success. And then I think thirdly, and possibly most importantly, it's that collaboration can only move at the speed of trust, and that trust and relationships are what makes collaboration endure. And so that means creating that space for that dialogue, valuing the different perspectives, and sort of navigating and interrogating that kaupapa together, getting to know each other. And again, I think this is one of those things that can be kind of pushed along. It was interesting to hear, I think it was James mentioned that, you know, one of the key outcomes from that early phase of the seafood work was that the participants really rated that trust had really been built. And so, yeah, great sign. Ultimately, collaboration's a capability. It requires people to be comfortable with, you know, uncertainty, confident to reach across boundaries, and kind of committed to building something together, and that takes time. So it makes me think of something that Izzy Fenwick mentioned recently as well, where she kind of reminded us that New Zealand's 2 degrees of separation is actually a really powerful asset, and I think we can utilise and leverage that in collaboration, you know, more than any other area. We're relatively well connected. So yeah, I'd say that some of those success factors or the secret sauce things that show up all the time are that shared purpose and values alignment, the structured process, and then deliberately building that relational trust as part of the process.
That's excellent. Look, thank you, Kim. James, coming to you, you're clearly an expert in this space. The research underpinning the work highlights the value of public-private partnerships and cross-sector collaboration in delivering long-term outcomes. So where public-private partnerships have been successful, what are the key factors in maintaining them over time? And how do we keep collaboration going in this adaptation space, knowing that, as evidenced by this project, these processes often span many years?
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks so much, Mark. That's right. So we've done a bit of a review of public-private partnerships as being a really interesting model for accelerating adaptation action. And there's a few examples on the mitigating side, so particularly designing greenhouse gas mitigation technologies and so on. But in terms of adaptation, which is a little bit more dispersed and abstract, it's quite a new idea. So in that sense, the Aotearoa Circle is setting a really interesting example and precedent globally. And so we're very interested to see how this could be applied potentially elsewhere. But having said that, one of the issues that we're going to have to think about carefully is, as you said, Mark, how you resource this collaborative machine, not just in terms of all of the partners, but in particular in terms of the executive, that's you guys, that actually make things happen, and keep the momentum going that Kim mentioned. And so we've made a few suggestions about how that resourcing could be reviewed, I think, because ultimately, if you guys aren't there, the agents of change, the coordinators, the brokers that sit in the middle won't be there, and then it'll be left to everyone else just to get on with it. And I think particularly for those cross-cutting issues, we all need you. And I think one of the weaknesses perhaps of the circle at the moment is how you are resourced in order to keep the momentum going. And goodwill is great. It goes a long way, but it unfortunately, ultimately, resources in terms of dollars are critical as well. So I think that's something that we will have to think very carefully about. How do we keep you guys going over the medium term, especially to tackle those cross-cutting systemic barriers to adaptation?
Thanks, James. So, Kapor, coming to you from a risk management and cultural perspective, what advice would you give to those wanting to meaningfully embed Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga in their sector's strategy and collaborations?
I've been thinking of this analogy. I'm going to say it's like you want a hot date, you better be hot yourself. So how do you raise your own capability and your ability as an organisation to meaningfully engage with Māori? And it doesn't need to be expensive. It starts with values alignment. It starts with purpose. It starts with respect and reciprocity. If you want someone's mātauranga, you've got to recognise that mātauranga is a taonga. It's not just something for you to extract business and economic value from. How do you develop these reciprocal relationships and nurture something which is co-beneficial for all parties involved? And again, you want to be a hot date. It does help to resource, get your own people inside your organisation to help lift and drive the capability. And again, just to the point that James made around resourcing. It is something that you need to resource if you really want to have a focus and a drive within the organisation to deliver on. And then once you've got those foundations in place, it is about building meaningful and long-term relationships with partners. And recognising, again, that point I said earlier, Māori are diverse. There's a difference between a treaty partner and a Māori fisherman, for example. So understanding the nuance and the stakeholder landscape is also really important. Kia ora.
Thank you, Kapua. So Stu, coming to you, and again, like thinking about resourcing, and you know, every business has an element of resource constraints. What were the key motivations that helped get this specific collaboration off the ground and really kicked you guys into gear? And flowing on from that, what were the biggest benefits of the collaborative approach looking back for you guys?
Well, I'll start at the end point. The number one benefit has been that of we've been a collective mind. We've had participation across industry, science, government. You know, everyone's sort of covered it, and the outcomes have simply just been better. We've built capability and understanding across stakeholders of all the challenges that we're going to encounter with climate impacts. And I think, you know, a motivator now, commercially, it's been a more cost-effective way of actually doing it ourselves. You know, if Sealord or Sanford or New Zealand King Salmon were going out and do all this work by themselves, it would cost a fortune. We've collectively combined resources with our money and the government's money and been able to deliver something that's fantastic. You know, and then from a personal perspective, I'm not a marine scientist. I'm not even a climate expert, but I have made some very, very interesting contacts, met some very, very clever people, and I've learned a lot along the way. And I think, you know, having that consistent team across that 5-year period has made building the updated marine scenarios, which we've just completed with KPMG, and acknowledge them big time, because it's a bit like herding cats. But we've come out with a great outcome because we've been working together for the last sort of 5 years. So I think it's pretty good. And, you know, and again, credit to Aotearoa Circle. You guys were the drivers of getting this collective together in the first place, and I think without that sort of core piece around us, that we wouldn't have necessarily got there. I think, yeah. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Stu. Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we're going to have to bring the panel session to an end. We've run out of time. So look, thank you very much to all of you for coming along and sharing your time with us today. I guess the question for some of you out there may be what's next, and what we've seen over the past 5 years is the power of collaboration and action. What can be achieved when we come together to co-develop practical, forward-looking solutions to the impacts of climate change. It shows what's possible when we face challenges together. And I'm sure you'll agree this journey has been long and comprehensive, but now's the time for action, which is what the collaboration plans to explore in 2026. So further informing the prioritisation of the next steps will be 2 other key Aotearoa Circle work streams. The first is a world first, integrated climate nature te ao Māori sector scenarios, which we've recently completed with the seafood sector. And the second is a 30-year natural infrastructure plan, which includes a substantial blue economy element. Your next step, if you haven't already, please download the toolkits and strategy documents from our website. They're freely available and designed to help you act in your own organisation. Following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link therein that you can follow. And at the Circle, we have more webinars to come. Next Tuesday on the 15th, we'll be focusing on future fit shipping. We touched on that earlier regarding decarbonising the fleet. This is a work stream recently completed exploring how New Zealand could transition to enable zero carbon shipping for our exporters. After that, on the 13th of August, we will showcase those world first integrated scenarios we mentioned earlier. It truly is a world first, so I encourage you to dial in for that. Again, a huge thank you to our speakers today for sharing your insights and leadership, to all of you for being part of the conversation. Thank you for coming along and attending the webinar. Apologies for some of the technical glitches we had. If you're interested in finding out more about how to get involved in the Circle, please do reach out. Thank you all again for this important kōrero, and hey, let's keep moving forward together. Ka kite anō.
Thanks, Mark.
Kia ora.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.